about the former First Lady. Author Jan Jarboe Russell describes some of the themes in her book, including the First Lady's courtship with Lyndon Johnson, the impact of her solo whistle-stop tour, and some of her family relationships. Her talk lasts about 45 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Barnes & Noble Georgetown. My name is Jane Graff. I'll be your host for this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening, and we want to take a look at American history tonight. It's frequently said in a city that has many misleading job descriptions that the most ambiguous is that of the First Lady. Does a woman seek out this position, or is it thrust upon her as a result of her husband's political ambitions? Does she fill that role as an activist, a political advisor, a spouse, a friend, a woman about town? Or is it in reality all of these things and more? Personally, I think the best description I ever heard of a First Lady is that she is all things to all people at all times, and she does it with class, a smile, and a serene outlook. Texas journalist Jan Jarboe Russell joins us this evening to flush out that description using one of our country's most dignified First Ladies, Claudia Alta Taylor Johnson, better known to all of us as Lady Bird. Mrs. Johnson was then and remains today a self-reliant and resilient Southern woman who knew from the beginning of her courtship with Lyndon Johnson that he would be the focus of their marriage. Yet she successfully carved a niche in America and in American history for herself. So without further ado, please, to join us and enlighten us as to this famous lady, please join me in welcoming Jan Jarboe Russell.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Hi, Dee. I thought I would start by telling you why it is I wanted to do this book, and then tell you about some of the things that I found the most surprising about Mrs. Johnson. The reason I wanted to do this book was that Mrs. Johnson was like every woman I ever knew growing up in Texas. And in fact is today like every woman I ever knew that lives in Texas. If you walk into a garden club in South Texas or in Dallas or in Houston or in Austin, the women look like her. She's a certain kind of woman. And it's not only in Texas but throughout the American South. Thanks. And so what was interesting to me was to try to deconstruct who she is in terms of her time and her place. The second thing that was interesting to me about her was I really wanted to know what it is like to live your life in a completely auxiliary position, completely subservient to your husband, and for all of your ambition and your focus to be on him, and to go through your life from the time you meet him until this very moment, thinking first and only of him. And so, I'm a feminist, and she's a pre-feminist, so in a way it was kind of like taking a look at your mother's generation and your grandmother's generations and trying to figure out what exactly it was that conditioned them to accept this auxiliary role in American life. I'd like to just start by reading a couple of paragraphs from the book so that you'll understand where Mrs. Johnson comes from. One of the most amazing things about her life story is that it sort of starts in the beginning of the American century. She was born in 1912, and it goes all the way to now. And so her life is a kind of a reflection of every major event of contemporary American history. But she was born in a certain place and in a certain time, and I'd like to give you a sense of where that place and time was just in a couple of paragraphs. The 17-room southern mansion where Claudia Alta Taylor was born on December the 22nd, 1912, is a house of spirits. The two-story antebellum house with a pair of 30-foot-high white columns on the front porch sits on an isolated rise in East Texas, facing a narrow road that winds through a double wall of trees toward the border of Louisiana, 15 miles to the east. As a young girl growing up in the 10-room house, Lady Bird always felt uneasy because the brick house was rumored to be haunted. The black servants who raised Lady Bird told her that she was never to go into the rear bedroom on the second floor, the one just down the hall from her own cheerful, high-ceilinged room, where she slept in a large four-poster bed, listening to the sound of crepe myrtle branches scratching across her windows. That other bedroom was known as Miss Eunice's room, for it was said that a girl ghost, the spirit of a 19-year-old girl named Eunice Anders, lived there. Eunice Anders was the daughter of Confederate Colonel Milt Anders, the original owner of the brick house, who supervised 80 slaves in the construction of the house, built out of red bricks that were fired in a large kiln on site. The remains of that slave's kiln still exist. As a child, Lady Bird played hide-and-seek among the broken pieces of clay. The kiln was part of her familiar world, as much as the 600 acres of pasture that immediately surrounded the house, and the giant 16-pane encased windows that ran from floor to ceiling. In order to be opened or closed, the windows were raised and lowered by pulleys, which made a shrill, screeching noise. The squeaking of the windows and the whining of the wind contributed to Lady Bird's childhood fear, as did the repeated telling of the story of Miss Eunice's death. Sometime after the start of the Civil War, Miss Eunice was seated alone in a rocking chair near the fireplace in her bedroom when a thunderstorm blew through the forest of pine oaks and cypress trees. A bolt of lightning hit the chimney, raced down the fireplace, and struck Miss Eunice, who fell forward to her fiery death. Periodically, a servant in the house, or one of Lady Bird's cousins from Alabama, would see her ghost and describe their visions to Lady Bird, who listened with her large brown eyes rounded in terror. According to the descriptions, when Miss Eunice showed up in a two-dimensional form, she did not look decayed or gray at all, but was said to be an ethereal, light-filled being, a slightly built girl dressed in a white dress with long sleeves. Miss Eunice's most distinguishing feature was her freakish blonde hair that stood straight up from her head, glinted and charged by lightning. These were the stories Lady Bird grew up with, of burning women and the lost Civil War. Like all of us, Lady Bird was a child of her heritage. She comes from a long line of female martyrs and male tyrants. The women in her family all learned to suffer well and in silence, while the men fought back against poverty and pursued power. So I think in answer to Jane's question, first ladies are not made, they're born. And they're born to be conditioned to a certain kind of life, which is a life of sacrifice first to their families, and sometimes they sacrifice themselves to their religious beliefs, which Mrs. Johnson certainly has done, and sometimes they sacrifice themselves to their country, which is certainly the case in Mrs. Johnson's life. If I could just say a few things about how she met Lyndon Johnson. She met him in August 1934, and what was happening was that Johnson was on a date with two other women, and Lady Bird was the third. And they were having drinks. They had known about each other for quite a long time because Texas, they were New Deal Democrats. Mrs. Johnson was a liberal at the University of Texas and was an outspoken proponent of academic freedom. She was a journalism major. She worked on the Daily Texan and was extremely smart. She graduated from the University of Texas with not one but 2 degrees, and was searching around for something to do and was extremely ambitious, but since it was 1934, her dream was to be a drama critic for the Washington Post, which I think is quite interesting because how she was going to get there from Austin in 1934 seemed almost impossible. But along the way, she heard about Lyndon Johnson, who was working as a secretary for Congressman Dick Claiborne, who was part of the King Ranch family in South Texas. So they met for drinks, and he was with these two other women, girls, as they said back then. And while one of them went to the bathroom and the other one was distracted, he leaned over to Lady Bird and said to her, "Meet me for breakfast in the morning at the Driscoll Hotel." And Lady Bird told me that when he said that, her first instinct was to run, but she didn't follow her instinct. She met him the next morning at the Driscoll Hotel, and they spent the entire day together. And even though Lady Bird was a proper Southern girl who had been conditioned to be fearful of men like Johnson, they drove down to the King Ranch that day, and Mrs. Johnson explained to me that she was so carried away with him that they spent the night in a hotel in Corpus Christi. And she said that when he showed her, they had 2 rooms, she was very careful to say, and when he showed her to the room, he very carefully let her in, but she said she slammed that door real quick because she wasn't sure of what he might do. And so, but on that first day, he looked at her and told her, "You know, I'm madly in love with you, and I want to get married." And she said, "You've got to be kidding." And then he told her everything about his finances, about how much insurance he had, about how much money he had, about his family, which was most strange. And he was giving her what we all know now was the Johnson treatment. And it took 10 weeks. He went back to Washington, and I loved reading their courtship letters because all of his romance was in the context of politics. For an engagement present, he gave her a book called Nazism. And because he told her she needed to bone up on Nazism. And he also told her that she had to memorize all of the 254 counties in Texas and by name, and also the major lawyers and county judges and political people in each one. And so he would constantly quiz her in these letters about whether or not she knew the difference between Durango County and Salado County or whatever. But when he would say, "I'm madly in love with you," and then instead of saying, "You know, I'd like to kiss you" or something, he would say, "When I think of you, I just want to get up on a box and make a speech." And she would write back and say, "Lyndon, tell me what the deal is. I'm terrified it's politics." And of course the deal was politics. And so they married quickly and hurriedly. They in fact eloped. There were only 12 people at their wedding. There was no time to buy an engagement ring. Right before the wedding, he sent a political crony across the street to a Sears and Roebuck store in San Antonio, and he brought back a whole bunch of rings on a stick, and each ring cost $2.50. And Lady Bird stood at the back of the church and tried one on until she could find one that fit. But when she told this story, it's so interesting because even at that early age, she never even considered how she felt about an article of jewelry that she would wear the rest of her life. It was as though everyone that I talked to, her nieces or daughters or whatever, said the moment she met him, it was just everything was focused on him, and she didn't even have any questions about her own wedding ring. There were many fascinating aspects to the book. You might be interested to know how my relationship with Mrs. Johnson changed during the research of the book. I did a cover story for Texas Monthly Magazine on Mrs. Johnson in 1994, and that's why I attempted to try to do the book, because I talked to her for 8 hours that day, and everything that she said sounded so new and interesting to me, because all the books I had ever read about Johnson were completely focused on him, of course, and they kind of portrayed Miss Johnson as the kind of little brown wren and the wallflower who had almost the little woman who had no impact on him at all. And so I assumed, reading those guys, those historians, that they knew what they were talking about. And I was stunned because it was very clear from the beginning that she was a tremendous influence on him in so many ways. She had all this money, which some people say is the reason she was found so attractive by him. I mean, she was the third in a series of rich girls that Johnson had dated, and in fact, during their first date, Johnson told her about the other girlfriends, and instead of being a little concerned about that, she was flattered that he liked her. So, you know, instead of saying, well, maybe he's after my money, no, she was extremely flattered by it. But what happened about the research is that we went along for 2 years, and she told her friends and everything to talk to me, and she continued to talk to me. And then a couple of things happened. I started digging more deeply into the subject of what were the key relationships in his life with other women, and I wrote an essay for the online magazine Slate about the release of the 1964 tape recordings. And in the course of them, you know, when you're in the Carol at the LBJ Library and you're listening to hundreds of tapes, you're so struck by his accent. It's so thick. It's even thicker than mine, which I know is thick. But I describe, and in a way, I felt so nostalgic for it because it was like the Texas I grew up in, where everyone had an accent, and it was a Democratic state at the time. In fact, he was part of what we call the yellow dog Democrats. We, you know, would rather vote for a yellow dog than to vote for a Republican. And I was listening through all these things, and I described it in the essay as the last of the really big hicks. And Mrs. Johnson read it. I didn't know she could get online, but she did. And she took great offense at the fact that I'd called him a hick, which didn't seem very surprising to me. It seemed very clearly to be a hick, but there you go. So she wrote me a letter and said she was terrified that that my conclusions would come at Lyndon's expense. And so she said, in this final sort of line in the dirt, there is no way to separate us. And so that was the end of the cooperation. But as it worked out, it was the best thing that could have happened to me in doing the book, because it forced me to talk to other people, and by then I had already interviewed her pretty much about the early years, and so I had to I went to the LBJ Library and did all the work I was supposed to do on the later years. Anyway, I thought now I'd open it up for questions, and we could talk about anything you want, but thank you for your attention, and welcome, friends. Yes. Anybody have a question? Yes.
Well, I have, okay, you shocked me by asking first. To begin with, I think it's fantastic that you did write about her, because I believe she's one of the most extraordinary women in America. I have an accent, but of course European, but I am an American citizen, and I'm very proud of my American passport. I always admired her as being a lady, and contrary to you, I did read about her in Greece at school because I was fascinated by her, that she did marry Johnson. And in Europe, of course, we marry for money, so we did know at that time she was a high-class girl from sort of a small mansion, and you know, who did accept the fact she fell in love with a politician, and he, quote unquote, married her for the money. Now being in the United States, I do believe that is not correct. They did love each other a lot. I did not read your book, so I would like to ask second question on the feminism. And can I add, what do you think, if you're a Democrat, about now having one Mrs. Doll from Texas, it's rather south, sorry, And then now you have, of course, the Bush family, that they are there, and Texas has become sort of a Republican state.
Well, one of the things that I say about this book is that it is a love story, not a fairy tale. I don't know, maybe in Washington people have perfect marriages already, and so the complexities of people that have good years and bad years and either stick it out or don't, but in Texas at least, almost everybody has a problem or two in their marriage, and has to cope with that. And the problems of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson's are not unlike the problems of the Clintons. And Mrs. Johnson, I sort of think it is interesting that there's always these comparisons to Eleanor Roosevelt between Mrs. Clinton and Eleanor Roosevelt, and I sort of believe that Mrs. Clinton has kind of remade herself in the image of Mrs. Johnson. They have quite a lot in common, and are handling it in a similar way, given the fact that one was born in a feminist frame and one was born in a pre-feminist frame. So I think there may be some kind of first lady syndrome that happens that I'm not sure of. It's outside the scope of my research. But what is interesting is how these family patterns do emerge. Mrs. Johnson's mother was a wealthy woman from Alabama, and she married a person who just was not much more than a tenant farmer, and it caused tremendous conflict within her parents' marriage. And before that, her grandfather was in fact was the source of the family's wealth, and he married a woman of less money, and that caused tremendous conflicts within their marriage. But I really do not believe, based on everything I've heard, that it's so simple to say that Lyndon Johnson married Lady Bird for her money. I think, if anything, that what he married her for is her loyalty. And I think it's a kind of case where, you know, sometimes if in a marriage one partner has one thing and the other partner has the other. And her early boyfriends said that Mrs. Johnson was always looking for two qualities in a man: ambition and perseverance. And boy, did she find those qualities in President Johnson. And what President Johnson needed most in his life was a feeling that someone was going to be loyal to him no matter what. And certainly she was loyal to him no matter what. So in a way, that's why I think that it is a successful marriage, because no matter what, you know, many times in the writing of this book, I would say, because there are some very painful things in this book about their relationship. I mean, one of the painful things that's in it is that when he was in the Senate, they were riding around the ranch one day, and President Johnson was driving the Lincoln, and Mrs. Johnson was on the passenger side, and there was a female in the middle, and President Johnson, who wasn't president yet, Majority Leader Johnson, was groping the women in the middle and right in front of Mrs. Johnson, who looked the other way. Well, that's a pretty rough moment in anybody's marriage. And there are other examples of pain that was caused by this and other kinds of behavior. But the truth is, as everyone said, Mrs. Johnson had two ways of dealing with this. First, she pretended there was nothing to deal with. And secondly, she said, well, he loves me best. So it was a little bit like that movie, The King and I, you know, where Anna and it has the king and there's the harem or something. I don't know. It's been a long time since I saw that movie. But anyway, it wasn't, it may not be an ideal idea. It's not a fairy tale. But I don't know. We're awfully judgmental about marriage these days, and Mrs. Johnson came of age in a time when what would have happened to her if she had gotten a divorce? You know, in the 60s, you know, what happened to women when they got divorces in the 60s is they dropped off the face of the earth. and what would have happened to her children, and what would have happened to her own ambition and her own business. So it's not exactly it's kind of an easy question for a woman who came of age in the era of feminism to ask, well, why didn't she leave? When in fact, no, I'm just talking about my own conclusions. That's not what you said, you're right. But my own conclusions, but what I came to is that those were not questions that Mrs. Johnson had ever asked of herself. And so that said a great deal about the era. Yes?
You talked a little bit about her experience on the Whistle Stop campaign tour in 1964 and how she felt being in such a public spotlight without Johnson at her side.
Yes, I can. You know, one of the things about Mrs. Johnson that you really have to admire is how she transformed so many of her so-called weaknesses. She was terrified to speak in public. And in fact, in high school, she was scheduled to be the valedictorian, and she purposely allowed her grades to drop so that she wouldn't have to give the speech and someone else could give it. In the 50s, as the wife of the majority leader, she took public speaking classes here in Washington so that she could learn how to give a speech. But the first time she ever really campaigned was in 1960 when Mrs. Kennedy was pregnant with Patrick and was unable to campaign, and Mrs. Johnson did a whole lot of campaigning for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket in 1960. But in 1964, a very unusual thing happened to Mrs. Johnson. She was the nation's most visible symbol of a white woman of privilege. And you're born in the South, raised by black maids. Her mother died at 5. And she went to school with only black children, and her playmates were all black. And but her father was kind of the boss of the county, the president, as it were, of his own region. And so she was very much a symbol of the segregated South. But after the assassination, it wasn't safe for President, you know, we got the Civil Rights Act passed of 1964, and then it wasn't safe for President Johnson to go into the South. There were constant death threats. And so Lady Bird decided that she was horrified that white Southerners were leaving the Democratic Party in drove, and no one was making any effort to try to convince them to stay. So she hatched this scheme based on some advice by President Truman that whistle-stop campaigns really work because a lot of people don't live in places where there are airports. That's not so much true today as it was then. And she planned this 4-day trip through the South, and she left from here in Washington and went in on a trip. And there was the FBI had a train ahead of her on the track that swept for bombs because they got so many threats against her life. And her message at each stop, and she talked primarily to white Southern Democrats, was segregation has to end, because if it doesn't end, there's no way that you can compete economically in the modern world. And so essentially it's either integrate or you're back on the soup line like you were in the Depression. So she made that pitch to them. And here she was. She also said how much she loved the South's ways. She threw out her recipe for pecan pie out into the from the train, and also Senator Talmadge, you know, was a big segregationist, but Mrs. Talmadge accompanied her on the train trip, and she threw out her recipe for ham, which was made with Coca-Cola with pineapple slices on the top. And so by day 3, Senator Talmadge was so sufficiently co-opted that he joined the train trip himself. And Mrs. Johnson said she was extremely shy about it. She thought, well, I can't even go to Alabama and talk to George Wallace. It wouldn't be polite to ask him to support the Johnson campaign. But by the time she arrived in Alabama, the Huntley-Brinkley reports were so favorable, and that Mrs. Wallace sent roses to the campaign. So it was a huge success, and Johnson, of course, won a landslide victory that year and carried 7 states in the South that he did not expect to carry, although he did lose some key southern states as well. So she was the first lady to campaign by train alone. Eleanor Roosevelt had campaigned before with her husband by train, but it was a very brave. It was, I think, her bravest 4 moments in public life was the Whistle Stop campaign, and I think she did today. When I went to Alabama to do research for the book, people really remember her standing from the back of that train and saying that we have to change. So it's a really fascinating 4 days in American history. More questions?
Is that a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have been lucky enough to meet Lady Bird a few times, quite a long time ago, and I thought she was absolutely marvelous. What you say about her loyalty, you get that right away when you meet her, and you don't doubt it. So I can see how he was so taken with her so quickly. But I have a particular interest, a bit selfishly here, in Lyndon Johnson's mother. And I also have a particular interest in knowing if Lady Bird brought Rebecca Baines Johnson up in conversation with you, and how she felt about Lyndon's mother, and if she even recognized that perhaps they were a little bit alike.
I can't wait for you to read that chapter because it is my feeling that the reason he would have never left Mrs. Johnson for anyone is that in his mind they were the same thing, that she was in fact she became kind of the mother wife. It was an extremely interesting relationship. Johnson was a very mother-bound man. His mother was downright mean. Like after the heart attack in 1955, she arrived at the ranch and the staff was just terrified because she essentially told him, "You have too much to do to sit around here, and get back to work." And she pushed him unmercifully to succeed. At the same time, she was Southern, and so it was always, butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, and these letters to them were just, that I went through, were just, "Oh, we love you, love you, love you." But it was always a mixed message that Johnson got from his mother. His parents' marriage was terrible. His father was an alcoholic. His mother had come from a wealthier family, and so she resented the fact that they were so poor, and she had to constantly borrow money from her family. So it was just a very interesting stew, that situation. But Mrs. Johnson was extremely wise about the way she handled Rebecca Johnson. In fact, the entire Johnson family. As you may know, his brother Sam Houston was an alcoholic who lived on the 3rd floor of the White House some of the time. And so it was an extremely difficult family situation. But Mrs. Johnson, had never had a mother. She died when she was 5, which is a key to her personality. And her primary identity as a person was she was motherless, and which is why she loved Mother Nature so much and found such consolation in Mother Nature. But Rebecca tried to become Mrs. Johnson's mother. The very first time that she met, she asked her to call her Mama. And Mrs. Johnson, in none of the letters that I saw, she referred to her always as Mrs. Johnson. And her exact words were, "I was not one to pretend intimacies where there were not any intimacies." So she kept her at a distance, and so because she just didn't want to be overtaken by Mrs. Johnson, who was extremely strong and domineering. But you're exactly right, because even though Mrs. Johnson was smart about that and kept her at a distance, Rebecca Johnson and Mrs. Johnson are cut from exactly the same mold. They both were very well-read women, very smart, not particularly beautiful women, and unfortunate. It's terrible to grow up in Texas if you're not beautiful, and if you're smart, it's even worse. And so they had that thing going where they were this radical combination of smart and not very pretty. And so they had that in common. And when Johnson described Mrs. Johnson, Lady Bird, or his mother, he used exactly the same language. You know, I'm married, I have the most wonderful wife in the world, and I have the most wonderful mother in the world, and they always care only about me, which makes you want to throw up. You know, they only care about me, and they sacrifice everything for me. And that was why he liked them so much. You know, the seeds of his narcissism are found right there in that mother thing going on. And by the end of his life, Mrs. Johnson had completely taken over that role. There's this wonderful anecdote from a Secret Service agent that told me that after President Johnson left the White House and was such a mess, one day they were flying from the ranch to someplace to speak in South Texas, and one of the women on the ranch that worked for President Johnson, Joel Malachek, was in the back of the helicopter trying to comb Johnson's hair because it was long and white and terribly unruly. Mrs. Johnson was in the front with the pilot, and Jewel couldn't get the hair right. And she had the hairspray, and she was combing and combing. And Johnson was like a child, like my 8-year-old son was, and saying, she can't comb this hair. She can't do anything with this hair. And Lady Bird turned to him. Finally, Lady Bird turned to him and said, "Lyndon, when we land, I'll comb your hair. Hush." And he hushed. So, you know, that's exactly the kind of thing. She had become completely dependent upon her for the most minute details of his life at that point. So they started their relationship one way with her, you could say, being dependent on him, and they finished up with him being utterly, almost childlike, dependent on him. So it's very interesting, the mother-son relationships. And if I could just say one more thing about Mrs. Johnson because I think it'll be particularly interesting to those of you who live in Washington. The most interesting thing for me was to discover that the roots of Mrs. Johnson's love of wildflowers is that when her mom died, when she was 5 years old, she was left alone in this house with this horrific father. And she would go out into nature. She had been told by a neighbor that her mother would sometimes go meet her father on his way home from work and with a nosegay of wildflowers that she'd picked, and that her skirts would be wet with dew. And Mrs. Johnson was an extremely emotionally guarded person. But the way that she grieved for her mother was that she would walk alone in nature in East Texas and pick wildflowers. In spring, when she was 13 years old, she had started this imaginary ritual for herself that she told me about, and she would search through the big thicket, which is a beautiful part of Texas where she's from, in search of the first daffodil of spring. And she would name the daffodil Queen, which is sort of what she wanted to become. She was an extremely lonely child. And so then later, between the years of 1964 and 1968, she planted 2 million daffodil bulbs here in Washington. And every time I see them, I'm not only grateful for her, but I'm also sad because I know they are an expression of a deep feeling of a grief and love for her mother, which is something you might enjoy knowing about when you see the daffodils here in the spring. So it wasn't an idle thing that she planted the daffodils. Yes.
Talk to us.
Yes.
Talk to us about her role as a mother. As we, living in the Northern Virginia, Washington area, we see her daughter quite regularly.
Yeah.
Good.
Her role as a mother was a very complicated one. She had no role model for being a mother, and her relationship with her daughters until after President Johnson died was quite odd, to be perfectly honest. Johnson was a full-time job, and she put him up first. I'll just give you 2 anecdotes to tell you what kind of a mother she was. Lucy Johnson told me that in her entire life, she was never alone for one instant with her father, which seems to me to be almost impossible. You would have to work. By the time Lucy was born, her father was majority leader. He was the second most powerful Democrat in the country. And he was constantly surrounded by people. As we know, he was never alone. Even when he went to the bathroom, he took people with him. And so Lucy Johnson never remembers having a single moment alone with her father. Even more interesting, she never remembers a meal her mother cooked for her except one. When she was 8 years old, and there was a flood in Texas on the ranch, the Pedernales River rose, and they couldn't get out. Linda had already gone to kindergarten, had crossed the river, so she was on the other side of the river, and Lucy and Mrs. Johnson were at the ranch together, and the water rose, and they couldn't get out. And so Mrs. Johnson opened a can of Campbell's tomato soup and put some peanut butter on crackers, and that was the only meal that Lucy remembers ever having her mother cook. It could have happened, she said, but it's the only one that she remembered. Lucy and Linda dealt with this in different ways. Linda has been quoted as saying, and I think it's probably very true, that she thinks of her mother like Melanie in Gone with the Wind, you know, that just constantly being the balm and sustainer and comforter to her father. And Linda revered her father. She was the firstborn daughter, very much a father's daughter, and revered his job and totally understood her mother's position. But she did, in fact, miss her a great deal. There was one feature story I read about where she said that sometimes when her mother would be gone for a long period of time, she would go into her room and smell her perfume so that she could remember her. So they have that political orphan problem there. Now, having said that, after the president died, the relationship between the daughters and the mother group has grown much closer. And the relationship between Mrs. Johnson and her 7 grandchildren is even very close. To this day, every summer she takes one of her grandchildren on a trip alone so that she actually knows her grandchildren better than most grandparents, and maybe a better grandmother than she was mother in terms of being hands-on and involved. So I think it was a problematic childhood for those girls, but they seem to have landed on their feet quite nicely. But opposite, you know, Lyndon always said about Linda Bird that she was so smart she'd always find a way to make a living, and that Lucy was so pretty she'd always find some guy to take care of her, and it's worked in reverse. Lucy bought the family business away from Linda, and Linda married a politician and has sort of continued her mother's pattern. So in some ways, those girls define themselves exactly the opposite of what President Johnson said, which if I were the girls, I would have too. So it's kind of interesting. Well, I thank you so much for your questions and I hope you like my book. I loved writing it. Thanks a lot.
We're going to put Ms. Russell up here at the table. Please come on up, talk to her one-on-one, and get your autograph.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Yeah, please do. Please do. I love talking with Elizabeth. Joel?
Yes.
Joel, do you work here at Barnes & Noble?
No, I just moved to D.C. I
From
actually work
where?
from Clarksville, Tennessee. It's right outside of Nashville.
Another Southerner.
Yeah, so that was a good talk. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Okay.
So how long did it take you to write this?
4 years.
Wow. So did you do it full time, or were you still?
No, you know what I was doing is I was doing work for a magazine too. But anyway, Chris, it's so good to see you. I'm Jan from Biography. Hi,
Gabe.
Yes, ma'am.
Where are you from?
Actually, I live in Memphis. I like it.
South, Memphis is not like the South.
It is the South.
How long's your book tour? Well,
He's a great guy.
is it?
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you,
well,
Joanne.
she's a great
I worked right across the street from her.
I don't even want to tell you how long.
Uh-oh.
Very. Yeah, well. I'll call you in the morning.
Yeah.
At home?
Yes.
And then maybe we'll see if we can do lunch or something.
Yeah, okay, because I'll be around. Good, okay.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, thank you so much for
I'll see
coming.
you.
Listen to me going, oh.
Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to get a book.
Thank you so much for your smart question. In what?
At the White House.
What, who
For
is it?
3 years, Case Redmond.
Ah.
Not, he was famous, he was famous in Washington at the time.
Yeah. What did he like? I bet he had a.
No, he didn't like Johnson. I like Johnson. I'm the one who liked Johnson. And I absolutely quote COAT.
Journalist Jan Jarboe Russell is a contributing editor at Texas Monthly and has covered Texas politics for over 25 years. Lady Bird is published by Scribner, a division of Simon & Schuster, online at simonsays.com. About the former First Lady. Author Jan Jarboe Russell describes some of the themes in her book, including the First Lady's courtship with Lyndon Johnson, the impact of her solo whistle-stop tour, and some of her family relationships. Her talk lasts about 45 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Barnes & Noble Georgetown. My name is Jane Graff. I'll be your host for this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening, and we want to take a look at American history tonight. It's frequently said in a city that has many misleading job descriptions that the most ambiguous is that of the First Lady. Does a woman seek out this position, or is it thrust upon her as a result of her husband's political ambitions? Does she fill that role as an activist, a political advisor, a spouse, a friend, a woman about town? Or is it in reality all of these things and more? Personally, I think the best description I
thought I would start by telling you why it is I wanted to do this book, and then tell you about some of the things that I found the most surprising about Mrs. Johnson. The reason I wanted to do this book was that Mrs. Johnson was like every woman I ever knew growing up in Texas. And in fact is today like every woman I ever knew that lives in Texas. If you walk into a garden club in South Texas or in Dallas or in Houston or in Austin, the women look like her. She's a certain kind of woman. And it's not only in Texas, but throughout the American South. Thanks. And so what was interesting to me was to try to deconstruct who she is in terms of her time and her place. The second thing that was interesting to me about her was I really wanted to know what it is like of the American century. She was born in 1912, and it goes all the way to now. And so her life is a kind of a reflection of every major event of contemporary American history. But she was born in a certain place and in a certain time, and I'd like to give you a sense of where that place and time was just in a couple of paragraphs. The 17-room southern mansion where Claudia Alta Taylor was born on December the 22nd, 1912, is a house of spirits. The two-story antebellum house with a pair of 30-foot-high white columns on the front porch sits on an isolated rise in East Texas, facing a narrow road that winds through a double wall of trees toward the border of Louisiana, 15 miles to the east. As a young girl growing up in the 10-room house, Lady Bird always felt uneasy because the brick house was rumored to be haunted. Like to live your life in a completely auxiliary position completely subservient to your husband, and for all of your ambition and your focus to be on him, and to go through your life from the time you meet him until this very moment, thinking first and only of him. And so, I'm a feminist, and she's a pre-feminist. So in a way, it was kind of like taking a look at your mother's generation and your grandmother's generations and trying to figure out what exactly it was that conditioned them to accept this auxiliary role in American life. I'd like to just start by reading a couple of paragraphs from the book so that you'll understand where Mrs. Johnson comes from. One of the most amazing things about her life story is that it sort of starts in the beginning.
Ever heard of a first lady is that she is all things to all people at all times, and she does it with class, a smile, and a serene outlook. Texas journalist Jan Jarboe Russell joins us this evening to flush out that description using one of our country's most dignified first ladies, Claudia Alta Taylor Johnson, better known to all of us as Lady Bird. Mrs. Johnson was then and remains today a self-reliant and resilient Southern woman who knew from the beginning of her courtship with Lyndon Johnson that he would be the focus of their marriage. Yet she successfully carved a niche in America and in American history for herself. So without further ado, please, to join us and enlighten us as to this famous lady, please join me in welcoming Jan Jarboe Russell.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Hi, Dee.